Okay, let's go. Welcome to our webinar with Gil Murciano. My name is Saul Shipp. I'm a board member with the Canadian Friends of Peace Now. We are the Canadian partner to Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, Israel's leading peace movement, which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We hope you'll consider supporting us with a donation. Just go to the donate page of our website, which is peacenowcanada.org. Today's webinar is also sponsored by New Israel Fund of Canada. We'll have audience questions after Gil's introductory remarks. Please type your questions into the Q&A function at the top or bottom of your screen, and you can do that at any time, even immediately. Please make your questions as concise as you possibly can. My colleague Jacqueline Schwartz, whom you may see now, will be fielding your questions. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our website within a couple of days. So it's now my honor to introduce Gil Murciano, who will talk to us about what's next for the Middle East and Israel's conflicts with its neighbors. Dr. Gil Murciano is the CEO of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, which is an independent think tank whose aim is to improve Israel's foreign policy and promote peace in the region. Mitvim is supported by the New Israel Fund of Canada, specifically their project to conduct research and analyses on peace and security after the October 7th attack. Gil is also a lecturer at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, where he's talking to us from now, and a member of the Israeli Arab Forum at the Atkin Foundation in London. He holds a PhD in international relations. Gil was in Canada just last April at the joint conferences of Peace Now, New Israel Fund, and JSpace. So welcome, Gil. Please tell us about how the many changes in the Middle East will affect the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First of all, just briefly, everyone is eager to know if a ceasefire hostage deal is about to take place in Gaza. What can you tell us about it?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. As you mentioned, I had the chance to speak with the communities both in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Vancouver in April, merely half a year ago, but a lifetime away almost. You know, when we speak about this change in the pace of change and the amount of events that we've seen right now. When we start from the topic of the hostages, which I think is so important, touches such a deep nerve how this entire destructive war started, and hopefully maybe where we can speak about exit strategy or about ways out. Can you hear me, by the way? You hear me well right now? Terrific. I have to say that, on the most basic level, I'm following the news as you do. Most of it is clandestine right now. At the current situation, what we know is that there's actually some level of breakthrough in the negotiations at the moment, where the major point of contestation right now is also about the number of Israeli hostages that will be freed. In some cases, there's all kinds of cases where the Hamas claims that it doesn't know about or wouldn't be able to provide details about the whereabouts or about the fate, and about the fate of the, let's call it, the main Hamas leaders, main terrorists that will be released, whether or not they will be basically expelled to Turkey or to Iran. There's an entire discussion about a number of figures. But, even when we speak about a topic that is seemingly all about negotiations and technical details, you already see, I'll say, one of the major ambitions of Hamas in the day after. Because if you look at the list of prisoners that Hamas actually put front and center, at least two of the three major leaders, the most complicated, the most hard to digest for Israelis, and I would say also for everybody who deals with counterterrorism, 2 out of 3 are not Hamas members. One of them is Barghouti, which was part of Fatah beforehand. The other one is the former head of the Jabba, the Popular Front, the PFLP. And I think you already see an attempt by Hamas to plan the day after, to maybe even start dealing or building the framework for future coalitions with certain post-Abu Mazen a representative, maybe creating a new type of or trying to show a new type or build the image of Hamas trying to build a new national unity. And when you think about that, and part of the things that we said that Israel failed to do, you understand the major missed opportunity today after this destructive and horrific war in the inability to provide an alternative. I suspect we'll speak about it a lot today, about the missed opportunity in providing an alternative to Hamas, of trying to shape or to create a new alliance or partnership. I wouldn't say partnership, but at least some understanding with the PA or with specific trends from within the PA. Hamas, there's no vacuums. Hamas is already entering into this vacuum and trying to create the day after on the political level. Yeah, so that's, well, I'll say in this point regarding the hostages. We know also that, by the way, the fault lines within the Israeli coalition at the moment, I think it became very clear when we speak about the extreme right. I mean, extreme right is a relative term, right? I mean, we're talking about members of the cabinet in Israel today. There's a clear indication there that there's a complete refusal to examine any kind of deal that would not emanate, as they claim, from a total defeat of Hamas, without explaining what it means. So, in other words, a complete rejection of any concept of releasing Hamas leaders or Hamas terrorists from Israeli jails. And I would suspect that would become, as we come closer and closer to the decision-making juncture, that will become a major clash or some kind of a rift between different parts of the government, with the public indicating fully 72% supporting a deal that includes the release of Hamas prisoners on that level. Shall I maybe just touch a few points, because there's so much we're trying to cover here. Again, the last half a year has been quite a challenge, not just for analysts, but also when you speak about policy planners and so on. But I would start from Gaza, where it all started, and maybe where it all hopefully will end, because we are talking, and at Mitvim we've been discussing it for the last decade. The Palestinian component in the era of Abraham Accords and regional developments, the Palestinian component being a crucial and necessary component of every future understanding or normalization between Israel and the Arab world. And what I think that we've seen is not just the return of the Palestinian issue into relevancy, but front and center as the main shaper of dynamics all across the Middle East. We just think about the chain reaction that started from this war in Gaza, that led to Hezbollah and the entire, we call it, axis of resistance of Iran to intervene, that led to the Israeli retaliation against Hezbollah, the weakening of its military power. And as we said, there's no vacuums in the Middle East. And then when Hezbollah is weakened, the old allies of Assad is weakened, then immediately somebody enters and fills this vacuum. And we are talking, of course, about HTS, the rebels in Syria, changing the dynamic, completely changing the fate of Syria in a manner that would also might influence, we think, of course, about Lebanon and the future political order in Lebanon, with the Hezbollah losing its role as a kingmaker on the political level, not just on the military level. But we are also speaking about Iraq. The shockwaves of that specific conflict are going to go beyond the region. So we are not just talking about the Palestinian issue, defining or shaping the regional reality, but also beyond that. When you speak about Russia's position in the region, the alliance between Iran and Russia. So we are talking about the Palestinian issue becoming a completely different topic, or creating a completely different level of sense of urgency, not just on the regional, but also on the global level. And that's a new reality altogether. With all due respect, when we speak about the discourse taken by Trudeau or taken by other world leaders in regards to the conflict, it's a completely different game, where international actors identify the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a core interest, not just another general part of the general foreign policy. So this is maybe one thing. The other comment that I will make, we speak about the demise of the axis of resistance, of Iran's axis of resistance. And, I would say the demise with a cautionary remark, if to be completely honest. Of course, we are talking about a situation when Iran spent 2 decades building this apparatus of forward defense, a set of a network, really, of different allies and proxies in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, all across the region. But in the end, in the turn of events, this specific apparatus became a source of concern for the Iranians, pushing them into a war that they never actually planned. In many ways, the tail wags the dog. In many ways, in this situation, instead of the other way around. And what we see right now is a major defeat for the entire narrative of Iranian resistance. Assad was very keen on saying, I'm part of the axis of resistance, and therefore I would not be hurt by my own citizens. I'm protected from domestic criticism that was already somewhat refuted a decade ago. But even when the axis is on your side, it's not necessarily a long-term issue. We see it already in the very complicated relations between the Iraqi regime and Iran. I'm saying cautionary remark because I do not think that the let's say kicking Iran out of Syria is irreversible. The Iranians have shown an incredible capability to enter areas of chaos and political transition. We've seen it in Yemen, in Sudan, in Iraq. We've seen that the Iranians were able to create alliances with non-Shiites allies all across Syria, also Hamas, of course, on that level. And, when push comes to shove, it's the Iranians that keep the lights open in Aleppo, Damascus. They control the energy market. Their oil is what keeps Syria running. So they still have a couple of cards to play. And I'm saying that because if we think that we can just leave this vacuum open and, and kind of avoid the proactive approach, we should think again. Okay, the Iranians are not completely out of the game unless we make sure that they are out of the game on that level. The third point is, of course, about the US. We are all living, and I think you guys probably feel it, it's closer to home for you guys, but obviously to us on the geopolitical level, it's very closer to home. It's very close to home. The fact that we're all living in a suspended reality until Mr. Trump takes office. And the uncertainty redefines the motivations of everyone. A lot of what we see right now, the Turkish move in the north part of Syria against the Kurds, what you see right now in Lebanon, even the Israeli military campaign in Syria to neutralize the old Syrian army and so on, a lot of it is about grab it while you can. Take the opportunity right now because who knows what tomorrow brings? Literally, really, in the case of Trump. And we can see how so many different openings were created by the current situation. And there's a huge question about where the administration, which direction would it take, if it would take any direction. Because we are really, I know it's a cliche, but we are talking here about necessities and opportunities being part of the same junction. The implications of not doing can also be damaging on that level. And it's true about Lebanon. We can speak about it later, about Iraq and about Syria. Last two comments about Israel, very shortly, because I suspect that we'll speak about it with greater length. You cannot really understand, when you look at the Middle East being reshaped right now, you understand the incredible, I would call it criminal negligence altogether. After my lecture tour in Canada, one of the greatest success of the tour was that I was quoted in Channel 14, the right-wing channel in Israel, took an entire part of the Toronto meeting that we had, and I hope to do the same with this part. So if you're listening, this is the one that is most... Now, I think that there's an incredible missed opportunity here when you have a government, really the wrong government in the wrong time. The Middle East is being reshaped. Military victories that were achieved with incredible, horrible humanitarian crisis and price that would define Israel and its moral standing for years to come, if you ask me. But even after you've done that, the inability to convert them into political achievement is nothing short than a criminal negligence altogether. And you have an Israeli government right now that conduct a war with two hands tied behind his back and one leg tied behind his whatever. Really only with the military option, that it can only provide the military option. We see it very clear right now in Syria. What is the Israeli instinct to uncertainty? An all-out attack to neutralize the Syrian army. By the way, I support the move in itself. Most of my Syrian colleagues, I in Berlin, I established a think tank that is based on Syrian refugees. So I have the connection, the unmitigated connection with many of them. Very few of them shed tears over the destruction of Assad's army, as long as there's no casualties. It's I would like to remove chemical weapons from here and strategic weapons, but it cannot be the only thing you do. There's obviously needs to be some kind of a political, diplomatic initiative that will go along with the military instinct. So right now, when we speak about the government that cannot even provide a fig leaf, the Saudis, in order to move to normalization, that could not use the time to coordinate positions with the Saudis and the UAE, we are speaking about a time that will be defined either by jumping into the abyss, not walking into the abyss, or a time of reconstruction. Gaza, Beirut, Syria, all of them. Right now, we're talking about reconstruction, and we are talking, and this is what we do at Mitvim, and I will end with this. Can we really use the great need, the necessity of physical reconstruction in all of those places that I mentioned, as a platform also for the political rehabilitation of relations and maybe even the reframing of relations with the Palestinians and the region? That should be the great process, and it will be with us for the next at least decade, if not two. I'll stop here, and maybe we can start with your questions and move on.
So let's go on about Syria. I think it's really interesting what you're saying. What should be Israel's goals in Syria, and how could they achieve this?
Well, it doesn't cross. There's all kinds of crazy plans by the really extreme right. These are too extreme, even for the government, showing all kinds of map of the biblical, settlements of Jews during the during the Hashmonite kingdom. Let's put that aside, okay? If we put that aside, of course, and we're focusing on whatever the mainstream is today. No, I would say that the two major goals for Israel is A, preventing any comeback of Iran in any form when it comes to the most important thing today in the Israeli priority set, the rearming of Hezbollah after they lost 70 to 80% of the military power. So that's the first thing. And it seems that, at least for the time being, there's no real threat. Hezbollah is isolated because of the war, and the mission of rearming it is going to be much, much tougher in the current situation in the foreseen future. The second goal is to prevent an even more wild risk, basically, in Syria in the form of some kind of a jihadist regime that also controls strategic capabilities, chemical weapons and otherwise. This is an effort that Israel took at the start of the civil war, if you remember, with this famous agreement, the Obama-Russian agreement about the dismantlement of chemical weapons that did not, was not fully utilized and fulfilled. But right now, Israel adopted a more, let's call it, kinetic approach of taking out the risk without, caring too much about who's going to take over those facilities. But of course, you are talking about the attempt to create a regime that will be non-hostile toward Israel. Okay, so those are the two major issues. But the third one is more on the level of utilizing an opportunity. And this is a very delicate attempt to create quiet, very delicate relationship with the Druze in the south part of Syria, sort of a political buffer zone, and with a much more complicated with Rojava, with the Syrian Kurdistan, with the Kurds that are supported by the Americans. Well, for the time being, it's another big question about the day after, but that's another. And the idea is to create long-term frameworks of cooperation, just like the one that Israel created with Iraqi Kurdistan. We call it an unofficial strategic relation. So those are the goals. The problem is that Israel, and I'm probably not telling you anything new, probably walking in the streets of Ottawa and Toronto, mainly the campuses. Israel right now is radioactive. It was always quite radioactive to be, to celebrate your public cooperation with it, basically. There's a clear indication about its might and its ability to shape the region. As a very good Syrian colleague told me, it's the worst time to be seen with the Israelis in public, if you're a Syrian, if you're a Kurd or Druze, but it's the most important time to cooperate with them under the surface, very quietly. But, still, there's a major problem there. I think one of the most important things that the Israelis could do right now, and it sounds marginal, but it's not, is to support the process of trying to start the reconstruction of Syria. We speak a lot about looking at the crystal ball and guessing where the HTS, the current masters of Syria, would turn. If they would go jihadi way, or there's an entire approach that says you shouldn't wait, you should shape reality. Meaning if you start reconstruction, you can create conditioning, not about some great Israeli-Syrian peace, but on the ability of the Syrians to uphold certain red lines by the international community. So if you ask me, this is something the Israeli can support, mainly by committing to the sovereignty of Syria and removing their forces. Okay, they created the buffer zone, but now with the conditioning that Iran is not coming back, to respect the sovereignty of Syria and to move to a new phase on that level. So that's my $24,000 answer to your. We can do 2 hours just on that.
Yeah, but just very, very briefly, to me, it seems that an obvious move would be to move out of the buffer zone, which so far the HTS has not really reacted much, but the international community seems to be very unhappy about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the move, by the way, the move into the buffer zone, I don't know. I mean, I think it was exposed now, started way before the rebellion actually took place. It started during the war with Hezbollah, at least part of the actions within Syrian territory in order to prevent from Iranian allies to use or to activate this specific region. By the way, there's a military logic to it. If there's no Syrian army who could uphold the agreement, then you need to do it yourself. Fine and all fine and dandy. Really, all the right reasons. The Hermon, the Syrian Hermon. But okay, once you've done that, and once the order in Syria is starting to take shape, and UN forces are back, then it's time, to slowly move back to the specific position. I'm saying that because Netanyahu yesterday, in quite a twist of convinced his judges basically to postpone his testimony on the rules or excuse that he needs to go to the Hermon, to the Israeli Hermon. It's not even described as the Syrian Hermon. We're talking about the mountain that has a strategic value and so on. So, I mean, slowly, this power dimensions, this kind of like maybe we should preserve this specific part is taking. I mean, I think that it's very important that it would stay temporal and there will be a clear conditioning. Once it's met, Israelis are out, when you think about it, Israel is in a very, almost accidentally in a very odd situation where its actions against Hezbollah are part of the narrative of the liberation of the Syrian people. And I'm saying it accidentally. There was no real intent, to liberate Syria through, but we are there. So the ability to somewhat control the narrative and not play the classic case of the boogeyman here has a value on the broader level, Yeah.
I have one question that interests me because here in Canada, especially Toronto, we have a very large Iranian expatriate community who are, of course, hoping that this might mean some changes in Iran. What are your thoughts about that?
No, actually, we should take into a serious account the idea of change in Iran. It's just that most of the time when I speak with the Iranian diaspora, and there's all kinds of shades and colors of the diaspora. We are not talking about going back to the days of Shah Pahlavi, the complete collapse of the regime. The regime has spent the last 3 or 4 decades building an apparatus that is controlling the economic system, the Basij, the Revolutionary Guards. It's a system that somewhat is too big to fail. Even under the maximum pressure of I remind you of the Trump administration, in the nadir of their economic capability, they learn how to adapt. And some would say even come stronger out of it. But what am I talking about? A change can actually happen when it comes to a very quiet, under the surface shift of Iranian policy to, let's say, more of a protective, defensive approach than what we've seen right now for defense or offensive capabilities, a more domestic, more focused, things that we've seen before, to be honest, at the start of this, of the millennium. And part of it is really the ability to somehow create a situation, an international backing for such a move. What we see right now is different. I think that what we've seen right now is a trade-off. Now that Iran is losing its regional assets, the compensation, I assess, will be in the nuclear field, in the attempt to maybe create a breakthrough or get closer to the threshold. Because, in many ways, those are two components, two mutually complementary components of the Iranian national security approach. If you don't have the forward defense anymore, you're vulnerable and you have to create an alternative. Of course, it would put Iran in a very, very complicated situation, not just vis-a-vis the classic international community, but also vis-a-vis China. Also, somewhat, I don't know about Russia, but definitely vis-a-vis China. And that's a major, major consideration for the Iranian today. Basically, how to move closer, and they've done that in the last couple of months, increasing the level of enrichment of uranium and so on, to get closer and closer to the nuclear threshold status without crossing it. But if we speak about internal issues, we have to bear something very important in mind. When we speak about domestic tensions in Iran, we see it all around in the last couple of months. But the ability of those tensions to influence Iranian foreign policy, nuclear policy, policy towards Israel, is quite limited, because we are talking about a decision-making circle that is not affected necessarily by domestic considerations. Sometimes people think that there's a direct connection between the two. If there are student demonstration in Iran, it would affect the budget given to Hezbollah. No. We are talking about two systems that are somewhat separate on that level. One of the things that we're trying to do in Mitvim, just last sentence, is examining, and I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but that's what think tank is supposed to do, right? Whether or not we are in the right moment, we are ripe enough to move into some kind of an Israeli-Iranian third party, how to call it, dialogue, but more of, if you will, red line, Cuba Missile Crisis, kind of, any kind of a mechanism that would prevent misconception or misunderstandings between the sides. The Qataris claims that we should, in our own discussions, but that's part of what we are examining today, as part of the question that we are asking about the future.
Let's go back to Gaza, which is I think one of the most important subjects. Does the current Israeli government have any plan for the future? I mean, obviously there are different elements of the coalition, but assuming that Netanyahu is in charge and that he knows what he's doing, what is his plan for next year or for 2 years from now?
Well, that's a hell of an assumption, that Netanyahu is currently in control when it comes to the Gaza issue. I think Netanyahu's main goal is survival, and probably I'm not presenting any innovative insight here for our audience. But there is one member of government that has a clear strategy, to be honest, for the last somewhat 5, 6, 7 years almost, and that's Smotrich. The idea of the decisive plan, the so-called decisive plan published by Smotrich, is the basic idea of erasing any traces of the two-state solution, kind of walking the cat back in many ways. And part of it is about Gaza. And the part that is about Gaza is that you already see an attempt to use practical changes on the ground. The issue of humanitarian support, for example, and distribution of humanitarian support, and to use that as a platform for the reoccupation and the resettlement of Gaza, especially the north part of Gaza. That's what we're talking about mainly. So, if you ask the government what's the strategy, they would say decisive victory. But then when you ask them the next question, what the hell does that mean? Excuse my French. Then the only one with an answer, and even he will be too smart enough not to mention it openly, will be Smotrich. Okay, we've seen those things already starting to trickle down into the presence of the IDF in Nesarim, in the corridor that separates the north part from the south part of Gaza. And slowly we see this policy starting to trickle in from practice, from the practical level. I don't think we're going to see, as we see in the West Bank, some kind of a claim or a call for annexation from the podium, at least not on the national level, right? But that at least part of the strategy that you see right now. And I have to say, this is a point where this government is a minority government altogether when we speak about core issues. It's not about left or right. Their approach is not accepted, and you can look at our surveys. I can send you some details later. I would say that there's a pragmatic majority in Israel that completely and utterly opposes any kind of annexation, especially of Gaza. But practice create reality on that level. And every day that we don't really solve the situation and we are not able to create mechanisms that would, in the end, would allow passing the baton in some phase to the Palestinians themselves, okay, to the PA, to the alternatives to Hamas, we see the opposite basically happening. And slowly this has become a reality on the ground. And so that's the level of strategy that I see right now. Other than that, it's just an ongoing situation. Even with the hostages deal that you mentioned before, one of the key elements of the Israeli government was that the deal would not stop the war altogether or call for full withdrawal or some sort of a withdrawal of Israeli forces. That's an important aspect here. It creates or it indicates that there's more goals to achieve, which are obviously not necessarily military or the military sides of things. And as I mentioned, Hamas does not stop in its, Hamas is already trying to create alternatives, mostly in the West Bank.
I don't know if you're following the West Bank. Do you see that there is any change in the attitude either of the PA or of the population towards reviving their goal towards more autonomy or independence?
Well, I mean, I think that right now, and the PA, by the way, it's a very interesting timing to ask this question because the PA in the last couple of days have initiated a pretty rare operation. I haven't seen such since the last, well, at least since 7th of October, to fight against mostly Islamic Jihad in Jenin, in the refugee camps in Jenin, and to try and prove its capacity to preserve its somewhat of its sovereignty. It's mostly, by the way, considered an attempt to convince the future Trump administration that the PA is not dead and that it should be, it should invest resources in it. Good question. But it was never a question of capacity with the PA. The PA in the last 2 decades was the main obstacle for Hamas terrorist attacks from the US Bank. With all due respect to the Shin Bet in Israel, that was a major, for their own reasons. It is much more a question of legitimacy when it comes to the PA than capacity. And that's a fundamental issue that definitely could not be solved simply by, capacity building and so on. When I speak about the public is a very complicated thing. I mean, it's hard to speak about the Palestinian public as one cohesive or one comprehensive framework. But I think that what you see today is a certain understanding that the Trump administration brings with it a certain sense of urgency to present, I mean, I'm talking about the PA, some kind of either a plan or grievances or, kind of trying to learn a little bit from the failure with the first phases in the previous government. If you remember, the deal of the century that was presented on the back of the Palestinians completely surprised them, threw them into some kind of and put them in a disadvantage. But there's another issue that we have to take into account. And the fact is that the PA is now, I know it's a cliche to say it, but it's a true cliche, is on the verge of collapse completely, mostly economically. And this is based on a specific policy by Smotrich specifically. I know I'm personalizing it a lot today with Smotrich, but in this specific case, he deserved the credit, quote unquote. What you see right now, unlike in Gaza, in the West Bank, we see a policy of annexation that is slowly moving from creeping annexation into formal annexation. We have many members here from Shalom Achshav, from Peace Now. If you want to look at the recent report published by Peace Now in Israel, you can't really, I mean, I would focus on 2 things, which are more fundamental than technical. It's not just building more settlements. It's 2 major things. First of all, it's kosherizing or legitimizing illegal, quote unquote, settlements, assuming that, all settlements are illegal by international law, but we are talking about the ma'achazim, those illegal settlements with it. 70 of them were already legitimized and connected to the electricity grid and so on and so forth, basically removing all boundaries and all limitations when it comes to settlement. The second one, and I think it's incredible, is the fact that in the last year, the amount of appropriation of state land in the West Bank amounts to half of all the land that was appropriated since the Oslo Accord, basically. So we are talking about unmistaken signs of preparing the infrastructure for annexation. And that's a reality that affects the public, the Palestinian public, and of course the PA. So the PA is kept on the verge of collapse. Okay, as a kind of a necessary evil, if you will, between different governments serving its function. And that's a situation that the administration is about to enter, the Trump administration, whether or not the PA serves their purposes and continue to serve as a partner. Yeah.
Well, that doesn't sound very favorable.
Nope. Nothing favorable about the West Bank at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. The one area we haven't talked about is Lebanon, and so now that there's a different reality that you alluded to, does that help or hinder the opportunities for peace between Israel and Palestine?
Absolutely helps. And I'm on record in Canada speaking about the fact that while we are all supporting peace and stability, in the case of Lebanon, I think is a very rare case of self-defense through and through, to some extent, of course. I'm not talking about the scope of violence, but the Israeli response against Hezbollah. And I'll say that what the outcome is, Hezbollah is not going anywhere, of course. I hope nobody, carry any illusion that Hezbollah is going to disappear. But I think that this entire war, besides reducing its military capacity, is also about reducing its political power. And that's mainly related to the campaign that Israel conducted against Hezbollah, but also, of course, the development in Syria, which isolate Hezbollah not completely, but somewhat isolated from its channel of weapons transportation from Iran. What can we achieve there is a situation where Hezbollah would no longer be the kingmaker. If you are following the current efforts in the last days of Pompeo, of the Biden administration, it's mainly appointing a president. It's solving the judicial or the constitutional crisis in Lebanon, which is, we don't have time to go deep into that. But the fact that there is no president and there is no ability to have an effective Lebanese government, which is almost a contradiction in terms, an effective Lebanese government, and still something that would enable the start of reconstruction of Lebanon, which is destroyed even before the war, which is completely collapsed socioeconomically even before the war. So the idea before that, the sides were somewhat of a very constructive stalemate or paralysis. Now, if we are able to do so, if Joseph Aoun, the commander of the army, becomes the president, then the political situation shifts in Lebanon. What can we hope for? We can hope the real discussion right now is on the UN Security Council Resolution 1559. In other words, the one that calls for the Lebanese army to concentrate the military power in the end of one national authority and end to the militias. And I say to that, good luck. If you know anything about Lebanon, that's almost science fiction. But what you can create is a reduced Hezbollah that keeps in principle its weapons, but is not in a position to threaten Israel or any other neighbor on that level. And that's way more than I would, pitch for merely 2 months ago. Okay, so I'll take the win here. Of course, it also involves an Israeli withdrawal in some point. Again, just like Syria. Finishing the military phase, moving back and allowing the Lebanese government to take control, again, with international guarantees. And here's a topic for you, for the Trump administration. Here's a win that the Trump administration could actually take through this involvement, maybe even defining the border between Lebanon and Israel, which is still a topic in consideration. So if you have links, but I suspect you don't, really, to the Trump administration, that's one of the recommendations that we are going to make.
Okay, lots of things to think about, many moving parts. So I'd like to move to the audience questions and pass it over to Jacqueline Swartz. Before I do, I would remind everyone that to type in your questions into the Q&A function. And that We have to finish the webinar definitely by 12:15 Eastern time, 1:15 Eastern time when Gil has to leave. So please keep your questions short, and hopefully they will be ones that can be answered without a whole long
I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
Point taken.
Okay, Jacqueline, are you ready?
I am ready. And I'm going to exert a little privilege here and ask my own question first. And that is, could you say something about Israel's relationship with Turkey? Of course, this impacts Syria a lot because Kurdistan. Also, I know that Israel, it's been up and down, Israel's relationship with Turkey. I know that there was economic cooperation vis-a-vis energy, and then before that there was name calling. So say something about that if you would.
Sure. I mean, Israel-Turkey relations is one of the core topics that Mitrim has always promoted through Track 2 frameworks and so on. And it's almost an axioma when it comes to Israeli-Turkish relations is that in the moment that you need the most, there's always the nadir, the worst situation of bilateral relations between the countries. We've seen that, by the way, in the past when it came to Syria, around the flotilla that you mentioned, the flotilla incident, there's a lot of issues about honor, humiliation. There's interpersonal animosity, I would even say, between Erdogan and Netanyahu. There's the ability of Erdogan to win many points in his own policy of increasing his regional power or image through attacking Israel. But I think that at the current moment, we are talking about different type of crises, to be completely honest. I'm not talking about irreversible crisis, but I am talking about, you mentioned the economic relations. Even with the worst crisis beforehand, the economic relations, the commercial relations between Israel and Turkey remained pretty much resilient. I would even say they even increased during time of political crisis. Now, for the first time, we see a broken vessel, basically, a situation where even the economic relations are being curtailed, being cut between the countries. Part of it is a national policy by Turkey. So this is a different type of crisis, which would be much harder to fix. And as you mentioned, we are facing a situation where the two most important powers right now in shaping the future order in Syria are Israel and Turkey. I don't think, by the way, all that I'm getting from my sources, I don't think that the Turks actually planned to lead a coup d'etat, not a coup d'etat, but a change of regime altogether in Syria. From what I know, they wanted to challenge the status quo, and then just as it happened with Daesh in Iraq, a decade ago, the weakness or the inherent fragility of the Syrian regime just been exposed, and with one small push, the entire regime collapsed. But I think that both Israelis and Turkish are right now in a situation when they are trying to use the situation to create or to use opportunities. I think that there is somewhat of a change in Israel right now regarding the understanding or the coming to terms with the need to speak with the Turks. And by the way, I don't think it's just about Syria. Turkey, for a long time, showed great interest in being involved in Gaza. Obviously being rebuffed by the Israelis for obvious reasons as a source of hostility. But Turkey has certain moves. It's hosting currently part of Hamas leadership on that level. And there is a potential here, if you could move beyond the hostility, to coordinate or somewhat create some kind of understanding between the countries. But I have to be honest, I don't see it in the cards at the moment. I think that this could only happen if we are talking about Israeli-Turkish dialogue through a third party, maybe with US involvement on that level. So right now, unfortunately, the miserable state of relations between the countries does not really allow for any kind of an understanding between the parties. I can't hear you, Jacqueline. This is just me. Jacqueline?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is from Barbara Landau, And she writes, this seems like an opportunity to resurrect the Abraham initiatives, which of course requires recognition of the Palestinian state. The goal would be to ensure that Iran cannot regain its influence in Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas. So it will require reassurance to Syria of being helpful rather than being threatening to Syria. Not provoking another enemy and instead offering humanitarian aid. All would help to rebuild allies with Jordan, Egypt, and Turkey rather than escalating more conflict. Do you agree this is a critical opportunity?
I agree to 75% of the analysis, which is a lot. I mean, really, I don't remember when I agreed with 75% of anything, but the thing is, Barbara is absolutely right when it comes to the potential, not just now, from the start of this conflict, to find a way to promote normalization with the Saudis, especially after, Iranian missiles flying in your airspace is a great way to find, shared interest between Israelis and Saudis. But I want to remove an illusion. And, we have among our ranks a Saudi researcher, Dr. Aziz al-Rashian, which is an incredible speaker, and he was also speaking in our annual conference. We need to understand in clear terms that the cost of normalization in Israel since the war started in the stock market in the regional stock market in the Middle East went up. So if before the war, the Saudis would settle for some kind of a fig leaf on the Palestinian issue in order to move forward in normalization with Israel. Just like you mentioned the Abraham Accord, just like the UAE, provided this anti-annexation issue to kind of prove to the world that they didn't sell the Palestinians down the river. Okay, the same thing, a fig leaf. That was the case before the war. Now, from everything we hear from the Saudis, they would need a real commitment by Israel. And the question is for what? I'm not sure that we are talking about going back to the negotiation table, two-state solution, but at least at a minimum, a commitment by Israel to pass the baton to the Palestinians in Gaza, against actual annexation of Gaza, of the West Bank. And the awful situation right now is that with all due respect to those shared interests and to the way that the stars align, all ready for normalization with Israel and the Arab world, you have a government that can't even supply that, not even fig leaves, nothing, absolutely nothing. So you had reports a couple of days ago, about a Saudi agreement that Israel would commit to a path forward of some kind of an understanding with the Palestinians, really rhetoric acrobatics, to find a way. Even that, by the way, most of the time is politicization. It's not real. It's all kinds of rumors floated around to the value of an Israeli-Saudi normalization, and not just with the Saudis. I'm thinking about Oman, which is a major channel to the Houthis of Yemen. I'm thinking not about Iraq, but I'm thinking about other parties in North Africa. The entire idea of normalization is here. It could be a real victory, when we think about how do you actually defeat Hamas. What is a decisive victory against Hamas? It's not the body count that already reached to 20,000 Hamas, terrorists killed. It's about defeating the purpose and the goals that Hamas tried to promote when they started their barbaric attack on October 7th. And that was two things: preventing any future agreement between Israelis and Palestinians and stopping normalization. So if you could actually promote normalization, that's the decisive victory. But unfortunately, it is blocked by an Israeli government that cannot move even an inch and providing nothing but a fig leaf. The 25% that I disagree is, and this is very important to understand, when the UAE moved forward with the Abraham Accords, it was never meant to be some kind of a choice of a camp against Iran. We tend to look at the Middle East in a very dichotomous or binary way. I'm talking mainly about Israeli decision makers. Either you are for Israel or for Iran. We understand today that when you speak with the Saudis or the Emiratis, they cannot afford the zero-sum game that Israel is playing with Iran, even after the weakening of Hezbollah. So when we speak about the Abraham Accords, we need to speak about it not necessarily as an anti-Iran. This is at least the perspective that the Saudis and Emiratis are taking. It's more of a hedging game for them. But all in all, I agree with Barbara, and I think we both appreciate the missed opportunity here.
Here's a question from Ken Victor that's very much connected to the previous one. He asks about how the uncertainties throughout the region impact the strength of the Netanyahu government, both within Israel and in the region.
Great question. Great question. I mean, first of all, it's a little bit about the devil we know. I mean, the interesting thing is, in previous, really, I mean, this is now I'm doing a freestyle. Really, insights coming from my brain for the first time. But in previous times when we look at the Netanyahu government in time of uncertainty, think Arab Spring or think COVID. People tend to cling on to Netanyahu because he was excuse me, French, can I say the devil and not be blamed for incitement or something? Well, the figurative devil we know, right? I mean, that for a long while, every time there was a time of uncertainty, you saw a certain rise in the support for Netanyahu. Not this time. And this is interesting. Netanyahu is still stuck on the same numbers, more or less on the same numbers, when we speak about this time of uncertainty. I think that when I refer to the results of our survey, when you ask Israelis to sit down and to think strategically, most of them move to the pragmatic level of looking for long-term political diplomatic solutions. I mean, things such as the establishment of a demilitarized Palestinian state as long as it's part of a regional framework with the US security umbrella. I'm saying it as in the passing, as if it is given, I mean, yeah, as long as those little things are fulfilled. But you see that Israelis, I think throughout this war, there's a process of learning about the limitations of the current approach and the fact that this government does not have a plan. Does not have a plan in each and every form. I mean, and there is somewhat of a yearning, even, I would say, for decisive action from left and from the right side, But it is really interesting to see as we move forward with the Trump administration. Some of those uncertainties become whatever they become, Yeah, sorry, Jacqueline. If you want to stop me, I'm going to go on and on. Really, I can do it.
Well, really I'm looking at the clock here and your schedule. Yeah. This is from David Burson, who thanks you for your presentation. He writes, BB stocks seem to be on the rise and the civil service is being weakened. Maybe you can address that. But what is the state of our foreign ministry professionals today?
Oh, that's going to be a short one. No, I mean, no, but I don't think that his stock is on the rise, but you are completely right about the fact that the campaign against the civil service in Israel is on its, on a high tone. And, it's mostly, most of the focus is about the judicial or the legal advisor to the government and so on. But it is also about the offices themselves. It's about the director generals that are political appointees and so on. The state of the foreign ministry is really, I would say, if you need an indication to the decline of the importance of, the already low importance of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel national decision-making, right? In its strategic decision-making. You can see it by the fact that the foreign minister was replaced during a war with very little effect whatsoever. Nobody would think of doing that during a war to the Ministry of Defense. Remember that discussion around Gallant, how hard it was. And unfortunately, what you see as a marginalization of this foreign ministry, it was stopped very shortly during the Lapid years. But all in all, when we speak about Netanyahu government, the decision-making about the crucial strategic issue, Israel-US, Israel-Turkey, Jacqueline, that you mentioned, all of those issues are concentrated by a very small cluster of individuals within the Prime Minister office, with very little effect of the foreign ministry on that level. And if you want a clear indication, even more clear of indication, imagine that Mitvim, who preserves a very good relation with the civil servants while opposing the political masters, is now part of the strategic planning of the MFA in the coming year. And Mitvim is an organization that is known to be connected with the opposition. So if you need an indication to the marginalization in an odd way, that might serve as an indication.
Okay, I think this will probably be our last question. do Israelis believe, this is from our chair, Gabriella Gallagher, do Israelis believe that Trump will allow Israel to do whatever it wants? And do you think, if so, do you think they are correct? And if so, will he be giving Israel enough rope to hang itself?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the most important questions, I think, today. Look, I think that the main issue about Trump right now is not his actually support of Israel. We are looking at the circle of advisors and appointees, all very pro-Israeli, but the level of uncertainty that comes with his term, especially because there's no tomorrow, there's no shadow of the future. This is the last term. This is Trump as Trump is. I mean, no filters if there were any beforehand. So there's a question here. There's a clear understanding, I think, among the more right-wing policy planners that the problem with Trump is that if he sets his mind on something, it's going to be incredibly hard to oppose that, unlike with Biden. So we speak about the deal of the century. There was a time the deal of the century raised great concern within the classic anti-two-state camp within the Israeli government. I mean, so there's an entire discussion about which aspect it would actually support. But there's one topic that I think most Israelis assess that Trump would come along and would support an Israeli action, and it's about Iran's nuclear project. And there's an understanding, in Israel, it's clear that the only way that Israel would go and do a large-scale attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is if it's going to be at least coordinated, if not supported directly militarily by U.S. forces. And that's one of the major issues that would be with us in the next couple of weeks, even as Iran increases its enrichment and the Trump administration is entering office.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, really interesting question.
I'm really glad that this has been recorded because there's so much here to absorb that I'm sure a lot of us will want to repeat it. So,
and by the way, you probably have my contact details. I mean, we are publishing newsletters, of course, and you should, if you haven't already, join them. I would love to send you, materials and policy plans and so on. Probably going to be in Canada again, probably towards April, May. Great. Yeah. So to be continued, and do not hesitate to contact me with questions or requests.
Will do. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, those could be sent to our website, info at peacenowcanada.org. And if you actually would like the website of Mitvin, I think it's pretty simple, right? MITVIN, mitvin.org.il, where you can reach Gil or his colleagues. Anyway, so Jacqueline, let's wrap up. Okay. Thank you so much to Gil.
Thank you for inviting me.
So deep, as Jacqueline says, there's so much detail.
We just scratched the surface, really. I mean, there's so many more layers.
All the way from the Gulf states over to Turkey and back to Iran and all the states in between, including Israel. What's going on in Israel. So thank you so much for all your insight and for your analyses. And thanks to all of our listeners, each of our listeners for your participation. If you haven't made a donation to Canadian Friends of Peace Now, I encourage you to go to our website and please do so. And finally, I wish everyone a happy Hanukkah and a happy festive season. Please stay tuned. We have webinars on a monthly basis, and there will be one in January. So thanks again, Gil, and thanks again to everybody.
Thank you very much.